Today we're talking about Chapter 12, Section 1, A New Era in Politics. This starts our discussion of Andrew Jackson and this move from presidents and cabinet members being wealthy, almost like aristocratic, to Jackson, who is our first president who was truly a man of the people, had been born in the South, grew up on the frontier. So we're going to see how a change in the country and a change in the way that the United States was going to be run would result in the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And our essential question is, how did Andrew Jackson become a symbol for political and social change in America? So that's one of the things we're going to look at today. So some of our key terms: suffrage, which is the right to vote; majority, which more than half; the Whigs, who were members of John Quincy Adams' former National Republican Party, who believed that the federal government should help spur on the economy; Democrats, supporters of Andrew Jackson, including frontier farmers and factory workers; a caucus, which is a private meeting, often a political meeting used to decide on who's going to be running; and the nominating convention, which is a meeting where delegates from all states choose a party's candidate for president. All right, seen here is something that actually gets used a lot in politics these days: 100% pure political mud. And you can't really read the directions, but the directions for use are open can and throw or sling widely. Ingredients: lies, distortions, half-truths, and so on. Now, what does this really have to do with politics? The answer: no one really knows, but it still happens. So we're going to look at how mudslinging in particular played a role in some of these early presidential candidacies. So on to today's lesson. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before, but democracy is not just a political system, but it affects the ways that people think and they interact. We talked a little bit about this with Thomas Jefferson, and about how his democratic lifestyle and democratic ideals poured into his political ideals. So in the early 1800s, there was a growing spirit in the country of equality. Many felt that the European views of social classes and social hierarchy really didn't have any place in American society. And a lot of people believed that the wealthy in America shouldn't be shown respect just because of their place in society. You had to earn people's respect. So this, quote, strange view on society was noted by many Europeans, and especially by this man, the French visitor, Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, he had been sent by the French government to come and study American prisons, but over several months of travel, he observed that American society itself was becoming more and more democratic. He noted that even though the revolution was over, the effects of the revolution were continuing to change the country, and America as a country was becoming more and more a country that valued freedom and equality more than any other nation before it. So this is something that's brand new, almost basically globally, where freedom and equality are valued by all the members of a nation instead of just a select pockets of people. And one way that this growing spirit of equality was evident was in the growing number of citizens that were gaining suffrage, or suffrage is just the right to vote. Now, originally, the only people who could vote were white men who owned property, but as more states were being allowed into the Union, some began to loosen these traditional restrictions to just white males over 21, regardless of property ownership. So this doesn't still seems very restricted, but remember at this time, this is still the era of kings and kingdoms and servants and serfs. So the fact that all white males over 21 were able to vote, like that's unheard of globally at this time. And with this new ability to vote, as the years went by, higher percentages of people who could vote actually took advantage of that right. For instance, from 1828, voter turnout was about 27% of the population, or the people that could vote. 27% of registered voters turned out, as opposed to nearly 80% voter turnout in 1840. So as the word is spreading, as this growing spirit of equality was growing, more people were taking advantage of the right to vote, and 80% turnout in 1840. And that's huge. And a growing number of Americans were getting the right to vote, but there were still, we mentioned, huge sections of society that could not vote. Women, Native Americans, and a large majority of the African American population could not vote. And that's not including slaves who had no rights at all. So women, Native Americans, and a large majority of free African Americans could not vote. And restrictions were put up to further limit African American voters, with some states requiring property ownership, even if white men in that state did not have to own property to vote. So what I want us to take away from this is that equality was growing, but obviously we had not reached full equality just yet. But even back in the early 1820s, there's this growing spirit of liberty and freedom and equality, and more and more people gaining the right to vote. And that is a fight that was going to continue to be fought for many, many years to come. But you can see the genesis of it at this point. So growing spirit of equality is reflected in the fact that more Americans were able to vote and more Americans took advantage of that right. Which brings us to the disputed election of 1824. Why do I say disputed? Well, because things didn't exactly go as planned. Because in the election of 1824, there were 4 men: John Quincy Adams, who had a strong support base in New England; Henry Clay, who we've talked about as being a representative of the West in our discussion about sectionalism. So John Quincy Adams in New England, Henry Clay in the West, Andrew Jackson, who was also very heavily supported in the West, and William Crawford, who was favored in the South, but he ended up becoming sick and didn't campaign. So it was really between John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson. So first up, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Now, he was the son of the former president, John Adams, and this John Adams had served as Secretary of State and helped end the War of 1812. He was very intelligent, had very high morals, but felt uncomfortable around common people. So he had been born into wealth, was very highly educated, very intelligent, but felt uncomfortable around average Americans. Now, with William Crawford's illness, like I said, he was unable to campaign. So the real opposition to John Quincy Adams came from Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson, who were both popular in the western part of the country. Clay, we've talked about before. He was very intelligent and had even served as Speaker of the House of Representatives, but was not nearly as popular as Andrew Jackson, who was the war hero from the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson was seen as being a man of the people because he had been born in a log home. How much more man of the people can you get than that? Which leads us to the, quote, corrupt bargain. Now, from this election, because there were so many candidates, there was no clear winner because the vote was split 3 ways. Now, Jackson won the popular vote, but no candidate had a majority of the Electoral College votes. And a majority, we know, is more than half. So that left it up to the House of Representatives to decide the president out of Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Since Clay finished 4th, he was not considered in this runoff. So it was between Jackson, Adams, and William Crawford, who mentioned before from the South, had gotten sick, didn't really get to campaign. So, but remember, at this time, it's important to note that Clay was still the Speaker of the House, and he was able to use that influence on other members of the House of Representatives to cast their votes for John Adams. So Adams was then elected president and chose Clay as his Secretary of State. And like I mentioned, Clay had been Speaker of the House and used his influence, which infuriated Andrew Jackson. Jackson declared that something must have happened to influence Adams's win. And me, looking at it from the outside, it's easy to see what Jackson was so upset about. Here you have the 2 men that you're running against. One allegedly uses his influence in the House of Representatives to get the other guy elected, and then the guy that's elected says, "Oh, thank you for your help. Now you can be my Secretary of State." So Jackson called this decision a corrupt bargain and accused Adams of cheating, bribery, and of stealing the election. And these accusations were not true, but the circumstances surrounding Adams being chosen were definitely odd. They were just off. And subsequently, this attack on his personal character, combined with Jackson's already big popularity with the common man, really damaged Adams' efforts to try and restore the nation.
In 1824, 4 popular presidential hopefuls split the electoral vote after a bitterly fought campaign. The outcome was left up to the members of the House of Representatives. They had to choose among former Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, war hero Andrew Jackson, Secretary of the Treasury William H. Crawford, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. The House elected Adams as the country's 6th president. Out west, General William Ashley scouts discovered a huge salty lake west of the Rockies, and Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to survey rivers and plan waterways. In Rhode Island, a group of cloth weavers held the first recorded strike in the U.S. that involved female employees. And with families having to provide much of their own entertainment, humorous and sentimental sing-along songs became very popular. This was America in 1824.
Now, Adams, he was not an idiot. He knew the people were upset about the election, so he tried to promote unity through economic growth. He felt that it was the responsibility of the federal government to pay for new roads and canals to improve transportation and trade. He also promoted projects involving the arts and sciences, but many Americans at this time weren't ready. They were opposed to using federal money to support these kinds of programs. They were like, yeah, it's all well and good, but the government shouldn't be what's paying for this. They were still very afraid of the federal government getting too big, and ultimately Congress turned down most of Adams' programs.
The American presidency, though it retains some of the aura of kingship, is an elective office deliberately distinct from monarchy. And yet, even in America, politics often runs in families, and certain prominent families have come to dominate the high office. The first such lineage produced was the Adams family of Massachusetts. John Adams set out to create an American dynasty, raising his oldest son, John Quincy, to one day inherit the presidency.
cannot escape my destiny. I am bound to my parents by more than ordinary ties.
The children of presidents historically have had a very difficult time living up to the reputations and experiences of their parents. It's not a promising prospect. Most children have not been able to get enough distance to manage careers of their own that bring them within sight, sound, or possibility of the presidency. So this says something for John Adams as well as John Quincy Adams, that he let his son grow up.
John Quincy Adams was raised at the family homestead in Quincy, Massachusetts, where his famous parents put huge pressure on him to succeed. His father lectured, "If you do not rise to the head of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness and slovenliness."
The first and deepest of all my wishes is to give satisfaction to my parents.
Forced by his demanding parents to grow up fast, by the time he reached his 20s, John Quincy was appointed America's minister to Holland. And in time, President Washington called him the most valuable public character we have abroad. Then, during his father's presidency, he served ably for 4 years as minister to Prussia. In 1801, when his father retired from the presidency, John Quincy returned to the United States to settle down on the family homestead.
I feel an attachment to these places more powerful than to any other spot on earth.
But by now, the first of many family tragedies had struck the Adamses. John Quincy's brother Charles, unable to live up to the family ideal, had succumbed to alcoholism.
The death of my brother affected me greatly. Now there is no passion more deeply rooted in my bosom than the longing for posterity to support my father's name.
Elected to the upper house of the Massachusetts legislature, 1 year later he won a seat in the U.S. Senate. And in 1809, he was named minister to Russia. Now recognized as the country's most skilled diplomat, it was John Quincy who negotiated the close of the War of 1812. In recognition of his accomplishments, he was named James Monroe's top cabinet officer. He proved himself to be a brilliant Secretary of State, perhaps the finest in American history, toiling over complex negotiations involving boundary disputes and the acquisition of Florida. And he was the chief architect of the Monroe Doctrine.
The Secretary of State always inherited the presidency. He knew it was his task to go on to be president. I think this was a man who was testing himself and watching himself and being uncomfortable about his obligations throughout his public life.
Make no mistake about it, the 4 most miserable years of my life were my 4 years in the presidency.
He was one of the brightest men ever to enter high office, and his administration was marked by its bold initiatives. He advocated federally funded roads, canals, river widenings, and harbor works. In a visionary program, he called for the creation of a national observatory. And in foreign affairs, he became known for his patient negotiations, concluding more commercial treaties than any president prior to the Civil War. But Adams's introverted ways and arrogant intellectual manner overshadowed his many achievements, and he became vilified as one of the country's most unpopular presidents ever.
I well know that I was never a popular man. I am reproached as a gloomy misanthropist and an unsocial savage. But I am not formed to shine in company. I have no powers of fascination, none of the honey which is the true flycatcher. I am a silent animal.
John Quincy Adams seemed to be more comfortable around plants than people. Horticulture was his passion, and he was the first president to begin what would become an ongoing tradition of formal plantings around the White House. Throughout his presidency, Adams took long walks by himself and swam alone in the Potomac River.
Almost every day I have bathed in the river and swum up to an hour and a half. On the morning of July 4, 1826, I received a letter announcing that my father was rapidly sinking. I immediately determined to proceed as speedily as possible to Quincy.
But the president was too late. John Quincy reached the family homestead on July 13th, 6 days after his father's funeral.
Everything about the house was the same. I was not fully sensible of the change till I entered his bedchamber. That moment struck me as if it had been an arrow to my heart. The charm which has always made this house to me an abode of enchantment is dissolved. And yet my attachment to it is stronger than I have ever felt it before.
2 years later, the so-called People's Candidate, Andrew Jackson, vowed to topple the Adams administration and everything it stood for. Following one of the bitterest fights in presidential campaign history, John Quincy was defeated by a large majority. "My career is closed," he wrote dejectedly. His hopes now focused on his children.
My sons have the honor of 2 preceding generations to sustain. I had hoped that at least one of my sons would have been ambitious to excel. Instead, I find all 3 coming to manhood with indolent minds. It is a bitter disappointment. I am aware that no labor will ever turn a pebble into a diamond.
Recently, his son George had begun drinking, gambling, and womanizing. "I have been horror-struck at your danger," Adams had written. "May I remind you of the blood from which you came." But when he demanded that George come talk over his life, his confused oldest son leapt to his death from aboard a steamboat.
Oh, my unhappy son, what a paradise of earthly enjoyment I had figured as awaiting thee and me. It is withered forever.
The Adamses passed on from one generation to the next, enlarging neuroses which got more problematical with each successive generation. Fathers in office are so perpetually occupied that sons get neither the attention nor the direction they deserve.
No one knows the agony of mind that I suffered. It was like roasting to death by a slow fire.
It was his religious faith that finally brought him around. That and a distinct honor awarded him in 1831 by the people of Massachusetts, who elected him as a representative to the U.S. Congress. He became the only former president ever to serve in the House of Representatives.
No election or appointment ever gave me so much pleasure. My election as president was not half so gratifying.
And so commenced the final chapter in John Quincy's long life. He served brilliantly in Congress for the next 17 years. And though his second son, John, also died from alcoholism, his youngest son, Charles Francis, would one day go on to become, like his father, a distinguished diplomat and a congressman.
All my hopes in this world are now centered upon him. I would die despondent if I were under the conviction that no remaining drop of my father's blood transmitted through me would survive.
John Quincy once swore he would die in the pursuit of duty, and in 1848 he received his wish, suffering a severe stroke on the floor of the House of Representatives. To the end, it was his family that had kept him going. That and a lifelong ambition that destroyed so many other Adamses. To have earned the right to be called his father's son.
So if he was going to win the election of 1828, Adams really had his work cut out for him. He was very unpopular, and he was going up against only one opponent this time, General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812 and hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And so Jackson was his only opponent, and his supporters were ruthless. And I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson talking about mudslinging. Well, this is where it comes in. This campaign became more about personal attacks on character than really on policy. Jackson's supporters attacked Adams as an aristocrat who didn't care about the common man, while Adams' supporters claimed that Jackson would end up becoming more of a military dictator than a president. But the people spoke, and Jackson won, and he won very easily. His supporters felt that that for the first time in the politics of the common people were important in Washington. And it was Jackson's election really reflected this growing spirit of democracy in the nation and the spreading of political power now to the common man. And this was evidenced by when he was sworn in as president, thousands of Americans came to his inauguration and then followed him back to the White House. And one supporter claimed that the people were excited because they finally had a president that was one of them. And they ended up turning the White House into this huge, huge party that lasted for days and days after the inauguration.
Politicians began to consider Jackson a likely presidential candidate. Jackson's chance to enter national politics came in the presidential campaign of 1824 with running mate John C. Calhoun. In addition to the old hero, the candidates were the popular Kentucky orator Henry Clay, the scholarly and aristocratic John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, Secretary of State under President Monroe, and the favorite son of Southern politicians, William H. Crawford of Georgia. Jackson received the highest popular vote, but since no candidate had a majority, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. There, the Adams and Clay forces united, making Adams president. Clay was immediately appointed Secretary of State, giving rise to the suspicion that a deal had been made. At a post-election ball, Jackson accepted defeat gracefully. But in the next presidential campaign, his party exploited the charge of a corrupt bargain. The 1828 election saw new and different voters going to the polls for the first time as states began to do away with property qualifications for voting. Between 1812 and 1821, 6 western states had entered the Union, with constitutions providing for universal white male suffrage.
The people's right demands our songs, the right of free elections, for government and order's sake, and law's important sections. We should support and pleasure take in frequent free elections.
By 1828, New York, Vermont, Georgia, and Louisiana allowed all their white male citizens to vote. Only 2 states, Delaware and South Carolina, still demanded property requirements. Up to this time, political appeals had been directed to individuals or small groups. Now, new tactics were needed to communicate with a mass constituency. In New York State, Governor Martin Van Buren had built the first political party machine, the Albany Regency. He now introduced the techniques of machine politics on a national scale. Political clubs were formed in every state to help get out the vote. A new career arose, that of the professional politician. Newspapers were used by the major political factions to promote views of their party and their candidates. Jackson's mouthpiece was the United States Telegraph. Almost every day, it ran an editorial to keep alive the charge of a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Jackson, aware that many of his potential supporters lacked formal education, directed his campaign toward the common man. Symbols like the hickory pole became more important than words. Images more important than issues. The opposition tried to portray Jackson as a reckless, ruthless barbarian, and reminded people of his tendency to be a hanging judge. Jackson's men answered all charges with simple slogans.
Now, this leads us to the development of some new political parties. Now, the Federalist Party we've talked about, and by 1820 they were basically gone. And so that led to basically the disappearance of political parties in the U.S. But by 1830, new parties began to emerge. They emerged primarily from this conflict between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. As Jackson began to increase the power of the president, those that disagreed with him broke away and formed a new political party. And those who supported Adams called themselves National Republicans, but in 1834 they transitioned and changed their name to the Whigs. The Whigs wanted the federal government to help spur on the economy, and this party was made up of businessmen, Southern planters, and former Federalists who still held to this idea that the federal government should spur on the economy and should be larger and should be more influential than the state governments. So on one side, you had the Whigs. Well, Jackson and his supporters called themselves Democrats, and this is the founding of the Democratic Party of today. This party specifically appealed to frontier farmers and workers in eastern cities, so middle class, blue collar laborers, as opposed to businessmen or wealthy Southern planters. So we went from a time where the Federalist Party disappeared and there weren't really no political parties to now back to having two major political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats.
Jackson's enemies in the National Republican Party may be appalled, but they don't know how to respond to his tactics.
But Jackson gave them further ammunition in the fall of 1833. He decided that the bank was using its millions to foment political opposition to Jackson and to bribe congressmen and editors into coming out to take a pro-bank position so that the bank could be rechartered again and passed over a second veto. So in order to prevent that from happening, Jackson decided to crush the monster bank.
Jackson cannot legally abolish the institution before its charter expires, so instead, he decides to weaken it.
The bank's charter said that the bank had the right to hold all the government's money unless the Secretary of the Treasury decided that it was no longer safe. Well, Jackson told his Secretary of the Treasury to declare that the money was not safe in the Bank of the United States and to pull out the money. Well, the man thought he was in office to follow his own conscience rather than the orders of Andrew Jackson, and he refused. So Jackson said, "Listen, you're working for me. You're not working for your conscience. Out of here." And he was fired. It was not until his third nominee to become Secretary of the Treasury, Roger Taney, that he found somebody who would withdraw all the United States deposits out of the Bank of the United States and then place them in banks that were friendlier to the Jacksonian interest, National Republicans. And some Jacksonians were concerned.
Jackson's forceful, some claim tyrannical, tactics help galvanize the opposition. By the mid-1830s, a new political party is ready to assert itself into national politics under the banner of the Whigs.
And The Whigs had been the name of the party in England who had always resisted the power of the king. So they called themselves Whigs in America because they were resisting the power of Andrew Jackson. And they began running candidates in local elections. They did surprisingly well. And so they went from strength to strength. What happened as a result of Jackson's attack on the bank was that the United States became polarized.
The two parties differ from one another in their constituencies, the type of leaders they attract, and in their philosophies.
The whole issue about where the government was taking the economy became the pivotal issue of all of American politics. Do we support a Bank of the United States, federal grants to internal improvements, or is the best way to protect American liberty to try to keep the economy as much the way as it used to be as possible?
Jackson becomes the symbol for things that are happening around him. He creates very little. My own sense that one needs to ask about those bigger social, cultural, intellectual movements that sweep around them and create figures like Jackson. Jackson's a very unlikely Democrat and not a very secure Democrat, but he becomes the standard bearer for those who are pushing at the edge of the limits of this democracy and take on this slave-owning aristocrat who's not a man of the people, but they invent him as a man of the people for their own purposes. The first people's president is really Martin Van Buren, but he comes along to consolidate what Jackson was able to symbolize at the beginning.
Now, these political parties looked for more democratic ways even to choose their candidates. In the past, parties would hold caucuses or private meetings to select the candidate. But this was now seen as being undemocratic because there were only a few people that were in control of these caucuses. So by the 1830s, each party started to hold nominating conventions where delegates from all of the states would come together and choose the party's candidate for president. The party leaders would still be in control, but at least now the states would have some influence in the process and more people were able to be involved in the process. And to this day, the major parties still hold these nominating conventions.
Through the years, as the president's leadership responsibilities changed, so did the process of nominating candidates for the nation's highest office. Each change brought the nominating process closer to the people.
We put our presidential candidates through this incredible gauntlet, the primary system, the conventions, before they even get to the general election period. And that's the way we test them. As so many other countries test their leaders through parliamentary leadership or coming up through the ranks. But in America, we really do it by seeing how well they run the good race.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone would ever sit down and design from scratch the system that we have. You have to have an enormous amount of money to compete in the nominating process. George W. Bush raised about $75 million in 2000, but it's generally thought that if you're going to compete effectively for one of these nominations, you've got to have 25 to 30 million, or you're wasting your time essentially. So there's a real barrier to entry, and the name of the barrier is money.
Only those who are fittest and sharpest and most determined make it to the end.
The goal is to amass enough delegates to wrap up the nomination long before the gavel signals the start of the Republican and Democratic conventions.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow delegates, please take your seats.
In 1976, I was President Ford's delegate hunter against a really severe challenge from Governor Reagan for the nomination. That was the last really, truly contested national convention that we've had in this country. And we won nomination at the 76th convention in Kansas City by maybe only 30, 35 delegate votes out of over 2,000 delegate votes. It was a very exciting convention, but the process nowadays is wrapped up well in advance of the convention. The convention is sort of an afterthought where the candidate can elaborate on his policy proposals and get ready for the general.
In a certain sense, the National Party Convention has lost its primary purpose, which was the purpose of nomination. But I think conventions have other purposes as well, and they always have had that purpose. They're really an opportunity for a party to present itself to a public and present its nominee to a public. If you think about the way politics is conducted now, election politics, it's a lot about 30-second ads, and it's a lot about 7-second sound bites on the evening newscasts.
Sound a resounding signal to America that Arkansas is Bush-Cheney country.
We don't have very many opportunities to see these people at substantial length through television. The convention is one of those opportunities.
Now that the convention is a coronation rather than a political confrontation, states have been scrambling to schedule earlier primaries just to have a voice in the decision.
Now, you can't be New Hampshire. They're first. But the next best thing to being New Hampshire or Iowa with its caucuses is to be number 3. Well, so many states wanted to be number 3 that it's now the case that they're all stacked up on the first available date after the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary have been held. It's one thing to compete in a string of single-state contests. It's quite a different thing to have to compete on a single day simultaneously in 15 or 20 states. That takes a lot of money. So we've got a system that places a lot of emphasis on money, a fast start, momentum, and yet doesn't give voters time to really get a handle on who these candidates are.
The fervor that surrounds the campaign for the White House intensifies as the general election nears.
The campaign is a frantic, intense competition. The candidate is frenetic, even if the candidate tries not to be. The people around the candidate are protective. It's like warfare without the blood.
We feel exhausted but exhilarated. As you can see around here, we've got literally hundreds of people coming in through our doors, ready to get on the phones. We have 15 or so crews of people out knocking on doors today. In the last couple days, we've made about 200,000 phone calls to voters here in the state of Tennessee. We've contacted about 30,000 by knocking on doors and passing out our materials. So we feel great. We're getting our voters out, and we're confident we're going to bring Al Gore home in his home state.
You need people who don't need to sleep, who can live on donuts, and who think anything is possible. It's very tough to be over 30 and work on a campaign.
It's very, very hard to predict what will make any presidential campaign successful. It's a combination of the qualities of the person running, the effectiveness of the team that comes together to run the campaign, the ability to capture the attention of the press, those who fund campaigns, who are increasingly important, and very hard to kind of pick a winner.
Every presidential candidate wants to be an outsider. Recall in '96 we had Robert Doe take off his tie, resign not just his Senate majority leadership, but resign from the Senate. And said tearfully, "Call me Citizen Doe." Well, that was his effort to try to disassociate himself from the Washington establishment, be an outsider. So to the degree that this type of appeal, that I am an outsider, resonates with the American public, it increases the likelihood that we're going to continue to have people going into the White House who find that their leadership really rests not on their command of party loyalty or their influence with fellow Washingtonians, but their only reason for their success and rationale for their being president is their ability to mobilize or to lead public opinion.
And the American people are awfully good at picking up, who would be good at this and who wouldn't. I mean, they have very good instincts when it comes to choosing leaders because they kind of get the sense as they watch a campaign of who's really got the capacity to handle all the different elements of the job.
Back in 1787, the framers had thought that once you got past Washington, people would never be able to make an effective choice between two obvious candidates for the presidency. But they would scatter their votes among so many provincial favorite sons. 1796, it winds up you have a very closely contested election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And that's rerun in 1800. So the first thing you realize, in fact, it is possible to make an effective choice between two preeminent candidates. And secondly, then everyone starts thinking about how to manipulate the rules of the electoral system to make the choice of the electors decisive. to keep it out of the House of Representatives and actually allow the electoral system to work. And I think the key innovation here is that by 1800, the states are clearly moving towards the winner-take-all rule. If you have a majority in either the legislature or in the electorate within the state, you get all the state's electors.
Thank you very much.
Even in the most tightly contested election in American history, the House of Representatives was not called upon to make the final decision.
This was the closest election we had in a long, maybe ever, long time. It was the first time since 1880-something that a candidate won the presidency through the Electoral College and didn't get a majority of the popular vote. The system was under some strain. I was down there in Florida, and I was getting calls from people that I had worked with as foreign ministers of other countries or prime ministers saying, what is wrong with your system? What's wrong with the cradle of democracy? And I would tell them, nothing is wrong. I said, we're going to resolve this, and we're going to resolve it with full respect for the rule of law. And there aren't going to be any tanks in the streets, and there aren't going to be any riots, and we're going to get through it. And indeed we have.
The vote in Florida has been counted, and the vote in Florida has been recounted. Governor George W. Bush was the winner of the vote, and he was also the winner of the recount. Based on these results, we urge the Gore campaign to accept the finality of the election, subject, of course, to the counting of the overseas absentee ballots in accordance with law.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, there's not going to be a written assignment for this lesson, but tomorrow there will be a quiz over the information from this lesson. And I want you to especially focus on the following. Tocqueville's observations about American democracy, the Whigs versus the Democrats. What did the parties stand for, and who did they appeal to? We mentioned the Whigs appealing to businessmen and Southern planters, the Democrats appealing to farmers and factory workers. And I want you to also look at John Quincy Adams and some of his policies and the ways that he tried to increase federal spending. What was the corrupt bargain? What did that refer to? And especially focus on this last one. How did the growing spirit of democracy in America affect the candidates and the outcome of the election of 1828? So it's this focus, this growing spirit of democracy that's kind of this overarching bubble, and these are ways that it's being evidenced. More people were voting. The election of 1828, there was a man of the people that was finally in office. So how the spirit of democracy was spreading throughout the country and ultimately being evidenced in this election. So like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me. But if not, have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.